So, um, when Lionel Messi hoisted the World Cup trophy in 2022,
Mhm.
like amidst all the deafening cheers and the confetti raining down in Qatar, uh, FIFA did not send him a single dollar.
It's wild.
Not 1 cent of prize money went directly to any player on that pitch, which, I mean, is just completely unbelievable.
Yeah, that headline completely breaks people's brains.
Yeah.
You assume an elite athlete wins the pinnacle tournament of their sport and just immediately gets a massive direct deposit.
Right.
Like, the assumption is that the money is just as direct as the victory,
Yeah.
but the total opposite happens. And the reason why is, well, it's a fascinating look into how money actually moves through large organizations.
We are dissecting the incredibly complex journey of World Cup prize money today. Because when you actually look at the plumbing of a massive prize pool, this ceases to be a sports story.
Oh, absolutely.
It becomes a masterclass in corporate finance. The path that $50 million takes from FIFA to a player's bank account perfectly mirrors how, corporate bonuses, profit sharing agreements, and raises function in your regular 9 to 5 job.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this because to understand what a player actually takes home, we have to look at the massive pot of money at the very top.
Right. To understand the cut, you need the scale of the initial payout, and you need to know the fundamental structural rule of the tournament.
Which is what?
The rule is this: FIFA pays the organization, not the individual.
Okay.
They are executing a massive business-to-business wire transfer to the National Football Federation of the country that participates.
And the scale of that B2B transfer is wild. Like the total prize pool approved for the 2026 World Cup is a staggering $871 million.
That is, yeah, it's an absurd amount of money.
Right. And the champion in 2026 will reportedly receive $50 million. Just to give that some context, that is a 50% jump from the $42 million awarded in Qatar back in 2022.
What's fascinating here is that you can think of FIFA like a massive government entity awarding a lucrative defense or infrastructure contract.
Oh, okay. I like that analogy.
Right, so the government pays the contracting company.
Hmm.
The employees who actually, poured the concrete, wrote the code to fulfill that contract,
The players.
exactly the players, they simply have to wait and see what trickles down to them based on their internal employment agreements. FIFA is the client, the National Federation is the contracting company, and the player is just the employee.
I mean, I need to push back on the B2B logic here, just from a pure business perspective,
Sure.
because FIFA generates billions of dollars specifically from the broadcast rights and the marketing of these specific star players. People tune in for the players. So why wouldn't FIFA just issue a 1099 or a direct international wire to the athletes? Why force it through a middleman?
Well, it comes down to logistics and sovereignty. FIFA is not a league of players, right? It is an association of national associations. They don't actually employ the athletes.
I guess that's true.
Yeah, trying to manage the individual payroll, international tax compliance, and direct deposits for over 800 players across 32 different nations would be, it would be an administrative nightmare.
That does sound terrible.
Plus, FIFA uses this prize pool as a mechanism to fund the sport globally.
Wait. Let me look at the math for the teams at the bottom of the ladder then. Because every single level of this tournament pays out. The runner-up gets $33 million.
Yeah.
But a tiny country that qualifies goes to the group stage and gets completely shut out, like losing all 3 of their games, reportedly receives $9 million for the group stage, plus a guaranteed $1.5 million just for qualifying.
That's correct.
You are telling me a team can show up, lose every single match, and their federation receives $10.5 million guaranteed.
Yeah, that is the reality of the structure. It is an incredible injection of cash for smaller football associations. The intention is that a federation takes that $10.5 million and builds training facilities, funds youth development programs, and, grows the sport domestically.
The glaring issue there is the word intention.
Exactly.
If FIFA just wires $10 million to a national federation and doesn't mandate what the players get, who is actually deciding the players' cut? Like, if we look at the 2022 tournament, Argentina's players reportedly received around $500,000 each from that $42 million pot.
Right.
That works out to roughly 30% of the prize pool going to the players.
And that 30% figure is a highly contested benchmark in the sport right now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, FIFA, which is the Global Players Union, is actively lobbying FIFA to legally guarantee that at least 30% of prize money reaches the players directly.
Okay.
They're trying to bypass the federations for that specific portion.
Yeah.
Because under the current rules, that 30% is merely a suggestion.
Which is terrifying if you are the one actually out there risking injury and doing the work. This brings up what I consider the black box of this whole financial journey.
Yeah, the federation level.
Since FIFA doesn't legally guarantee that player cut, the money flow from the federation to the players is entirely at the mercy of the administrators.
And the structural incentives inside that black box are heavily skewed against the players.
But so?
Well, federations have their own operational costs, executive salaries, domestic projects to fund. Without a global mandate forcing their hand, federations are naturally incentivized to hold on to as much of that cash as possible.
Which means?
Which leads to wild disparities in compensation depending entirely on what passport a player holds.
It sounds like a wildly unpredictable restaurant tip jar.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Right. The owner takes all the cash tips left on the tables into a back room, closes the door, and then decides at the end of the night who deserves what based on their attitude or the restaurant's overhead costs, rather than the work the servers actually did.
That is a perfect analogy. And we see the consequences of that tip jar mentality playing out in real time.
Oh, yeah.
Several African federations, for example, have had highly documented public disputes with their players over this exact mechanism. Just recently, leading up to 2026, Nigeria's players threatened to completely boycott training during a major tournament over delayed or incomplete bonus transfers.
And people look at those boycotts and think it's just athletes being greedy. But it's an organizational failure. You have employees who generated millions of dollars in revenue, and they're trying to negotiate their compensation after the work is already done, and the revenue has already been paid to their boss.
You have zero leverage in that scenario. Without a strict, written pre-tournament agreement, players are completely powerless.
Yeah.
If the federation administrators declare that they need to retain the prize money to cover travel costs or general administrative expenses, the players have virtually no legal recourse. They are relying entirely on goodwill.
I know this feeling intimately from the corporate world. It is the dreaded discretionary bonus. Ugh, yes.
You work in tech, your team grinds for 9 months, you hit all your OKRs, and the company lands a massive enterprise client. Your manager pulls you aside and says, "Incredible work, there is going to be a bonus at the end of the year."
But there is no formula.
There is no math. December rolls around and they hand you a branded fleece jacket and a $50 gift card to a steakhouse.
Yep. The discretionary bonus is a tool designed to extract maximum effort for minimum guaranteed liability. The only way to counter it is by removing the discretion entirely.
Which is exactly what we see on the other end of the spectrum. If the discretionary model is the danger zone, the U.S. Soccer Federation is what we call the gold standard.
Right.
They reportedly pass 80% or more of the prize money back to the players, and crucially, they split it equally between the men's and women's teams.
But we have to examine the mechanism of how they achieved that 80% split. The U.S. Federation did not just wake up one day and decide to be exceptionally generous.
Definitely not. That structure was forged through rigorous collective bargaining. The players recognized their leverage. They are the product. They formed a united front, negotiated as a single entity, and got those terms legally bound in a contract before anyone ever set foot on a pitch.
It is the ultimate proof that you don't get what you deserve, you get what you negotiate.
Exactly.
Then you have countries operating in a middle ground. Like in 2022, Australia reportedly split about half of their prize money with the players, but they used a performance-based metric.
Right, based on playing time.
Yeah. A first-team player who was out on the grass for the majority of the matches received an estimated $220,000. But a player who rode the bench received significantly less.
And that maps perfectly to a corporate performance-based bonus pool, where individual metrics or billable hours dictate your specific slice of the pie. It is transparent, mathematically verifiable, and agreed upon in advance.
Okay, let's play this out. Like say you are a player in a fantastic situation. You have a transparent federation, a strong union, and a locked-in formula. You have survived the black box.
Sounds great so far.
You are promised a $500,000 bonus for your performance. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh, the reality check.
Yes. The headline number that gets leaked to the press and printed in the articles is an absolute illusion.
Because gross pay is a marketing metric. Net pay is the only reality that matters, whether you are an elite striker or a mid-level manager.
The math starts aggressively chipping away at that $500,000 the second it is announced. The biggest and most immediate deduction is taxes. We are talking about top-tier athletes who mostly live and play in countries with incredibly high marginal tax rates.
We need to define how that tax is applied too, because it is punitive. This bonus is not their base salary. It is treated as supplemental income.
Right.
Since professional players are already earning high base salaries from their club teams, this World Cup bonus is stacked on top of their existing earnings. It is taxed at the absolute highest possible marginal bracket they qualify for.
If you are a resident of Spain or the UK, that top marginal rate can easily exceed 45%. So right off the bat, before you even blink, that $500,000 loses roughly $225,000 to the government.
Yep.
We are instantly down to $275,000.
And the deductions don't stop at the government. You also have to account for the private middlemen. Almost every professional player operates with an agent or a management agency.
Of course.
These representatives negotiate the commercial rights and club contracts that make the player's career possible, and their contracts typically entitle them to a 5% to 10% cut of all football-related earnings.
So we take another $25,000 to $50,000 right off the top. Your spectacular, life-changing $500,000 windfall is now a $225,000 to $250,000 net payment.
Exactly.
Don't get me wrong, $250,000 is a fantastic amount of money, but it is literally half of the headline number.
And we haven't even factored in the cash flow timing gap, which fundamentally changes the utility of that money.
Wait, I assume they just wire the money the week after the tournament ends.
No, FIFA doesn't operate like that. They pay the national federations in tranches.
Tranches.
Yeah, a tranche is essentially a phased payout structure.
Mm-hmm.
It's similar to how you would pay a general contractor building a house. You release a percentage of the funds when the foundation is poured, another percentage when the framing is done, and the final payment upon completion.
Okay, so a player might win the tournament in July, but the federation doesn't receive the final tranche of the prize money from FIFA until November or December.
Which means the player might not see their net payout hit their bank account until the following calendar year. They are floating the mental and sometimes financial expectation of a massive bonus for 6 months before it actually materializes.
I have a personal money mistake that makes me feel this in my bones.
Oh, do share.
Early in my career, I was doing some freelance tech consulting on the side. I closed a massive $8,000 contract. I was ecstatic.
I bet.
I took my friends out to dinner, bought some celebratory drinks, and genuinely felt like I had unlocked a new level of wealth.
The gross revenue high.
Exactly. Then the reality of the mechanisms kicked in. I had completely ignored the 15% self-employment tax. I hadn't factored in the new software licenses I was required to purchase to actually execute the contract. And the absolute worst part,
Boy.
the corporate client had net 60 payment terms.
Oh, the dreaded 2-month wait.
2 full months. I didn't see a dime for 60 days. By the time that money finally landed in my checking account, after taxes and overhead, my net take-home was closer to $4,500. I was literally stressing over my monthly rent while waiting for an $8,000 check that was actually a $4,500 check.
Your freelance contract and a World Cup prize pool operate on the exact same principles. Headline numbers lie in every single industry.
They really do.
When a creator on social media boasts about their top-line revenue, or a tech startup announces its gross profit, or FIFA puts out a press release about an $871 million prize pool, that is purely marketing. The gross number is for the public. The net number is for your actual life.
This entire sports drama is just a magnified version of what happens in regular corporate offices. The structures that govern how a World Cup payout is distributed are the exact same structures that dictate your end-of-year bonus, your equity grant, or your profit-sharing agreement. So what does this all mean?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can extract 3 very clear, actionable frameworks to protect ourselves in the workplace. The first framework is to understand the plumbing of your compensation. You have to know your mechanism.
People always focus on the wrong question. They ask their boss, how much is the bonus? You should never ask how much. You have to ask, how is it calculated?
Exactly. The players who receive their full share are the ones who have a mathematically verifiable formula in a legally binding contract. The players who find themselves threatening to boycott training camps are the ones who relied on a handshake and the vague promise of a discretionary payout.
Yeah.
You need to know if your bonus is guaranteed, if it is tied to a specific revenue OKR, or if it is entirely at the whim of an administrator.
Never accept a manager telling you, we'll take care of you if we have a good quarter. That is code for the branded fleece jacket.
It really is.
You want a contract that says you receive 5% of net profits as defined by this specific accounting standard. The second framework is something I think tech workers and corporate employees are finally waking up to, the power of collective leverage.
Because individual negotiating power is inherently fragile. When you sit across the table from a massive organization, whether it is a national sports federation or a multinational tech conglomerate, you are at a distinct disadvantage.
Always.
They have access to more lawyers, more historical data, and vastly more capital than you do.
Yeah, this is exactly how U.S. soccer achieved the 80% split. They stopped fighting the battle alone.
They shifted the power dynamic by organizing. And for someone working a regular job, collective leverage doesn't necessarily mean you have to form a formal union, though that is highly effective.
Right.
It can simply mean engaging in salary-sharing networks with your peers or participating in industry associations. When workers communicate and negotiate collectively, the administrative black box gets forced open.
Transparency destroys the discretionary tip jar. The minute everyone knows what the total pool is and everyone agrees on the formula, the company can no longer play employees against each other. Which brings us to the final framework, the reality check. You have to aggressively calculate your net.
The gross number is an illusion meant to make the company look generous. Whenever you are offered a new salary, a sign-on bonus, or a freelance rate, you must immediately strip away the marketing. Subtract your marginal tax rate. Subtract any union dues, platform fees, or agent cuts.
You also have to calculate the cost of the delay. If a company promises a performance bonus that pays out in March, but you completed the underlying work in October, you are essentially giving them an interest-free loan for 5 months.
Yeah.
How does that cash flow gap affect your financial planning? Always build your personal budget based on the net utility of the money, never the gross promise.
Reframing compensation this way takes the emotion out of the headline number. It transforms you from a passive employee waiting to see what trickles down into an active, informed participant in your own financial life.
I want you to think about your current job for a second. Do you actually know how your bonus is calculated, like, in detail? If you opened your employment agreement right now, is there a clear mathematical formula, or is it just a vague paragraph about overall company performance?
It's a great question.
Drop it in the comments wherever you are listening to this type. Yes, I know exactly, or honestly, no idea. There is no shame in the second answer, but recognizing you are operating in a black box is the first step to fixing it.
If you found this breakdown helpful, and if it made you think a little differently about the hidden mechanisms behind the money in your own career, we would love for you to subscribe to the show. We dive into these types of structures all the time, looking past the shiny headlines to uncover the real mechanics of wealth, negotiation, and leverage. It's totally free, and it helps us keep bringing you these insights.
Awesome.
I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought based on the research we dug into today. The average professional athlete retires around age 35. Their peak earning window is incredibly brief, averaging just 8 years.
Wow, just 8 years.
Yeah. So if the ultimate prize money, at the absolute pinnacle of their career, is this heavily taxed, aggressively delayed, and completely controlled by layers of middlemen and administrators, how does that fundamentally change how we view the supposed financial security of those brief, high-earning careers?
That's fascinating.
When you compare a volatile, heavily taxed 8-year sprint to the compounding power of slow, steady lifetime earnings, where you control the mechanism, who actually has the better deal?
That is a question that will definitely keep me up tonight. Know your mechanism. Know your net. Build your leverage. See you next week.